So again, everyone, welcome. My name is Serafina Smith, and I'm one of the assistant deans at the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences. Today, we have Jonathan Cruz, Dr. Jonathan Cruz, who's a scientist at Regeneron, and he's also a double alum from Rutgers University and the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences. So I'd like to welcome Jonathan to share a little bit of information about the impact of infectious diseases and on food and safety and security. So Jonathan, if you'd like to join us and unmute, I'm going to unshare my screen so that you can share your screen with us. I know our students are very excited as this is the final presentation during our speaker series, and they all have been joining our sessions, eagerly joining and asking questions about all the several topics. But I think today's topic is so crucial and important for us to understand of how COVID-19 and different infectious diseases have really can impact food security and safety. So without further ado, I'd like to just welcome you and have you join us to say hello to the students.
So hi everyone, and thank you for that welcome. I'm really excited to be presenting to you guys today about some of the work that, just kind of give you an overview of how I got to where I am, and also just to kind of give you an overview of infectious diseases and the number of impacts they can have on food safety and security. Just move through the presentation. All right, so just a little bit about myself. I did attend Rutgers University as both an undergraduate and a graduate student. So as an undergraduate, I was at the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences, which was Cook College at the time. So I majored in food science and microbiology. So infectious diseases and food science are topics that are near and dear to my heart. As an undergraduate, I did some research on different ways to inactivate bacterial spores. So I was an undergrad shortly after September 11th, and there was concern that the food supply could be a target for different terrorist activities. Maybe someone would intentionally put some kind of contaminant in there. So we were looking for ways to secure the food supply. So that was some really interesting research. And also was happy to partake in a variety of different opportunities that were at SEBS, whether they were different kind of councils or sports. We had a lot of different intramural sports. So it was a really great time. So I decided after graduating to stay at Rutgers. I went to graduate school there as well. So I was at Rutgers for another 6 years to get my PhD. So there I worked in a lab that really focused on bacterial stress response systems. So bacteria can survive in some very, very harsh conditions. They've developed a lot of different ways to do that. And we were really interested in this one particular way that uses these small stress response elements. And a lot can be found in organisms, in certain pathogens like Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which causes tuberculosis. And it's thought that maybe these systems allow it to survive in the host for so long, and that's why it can cause the infection that it does. It's actually estimated that about 2 billion people on Earth are infected with tuberculosis in a latent form, and it could be these stress response elements that are playing some role in that. And then it was a great opportunity. I got to attend a variety of different meetings and conferences and interact with a diverse array of scientists studying all kinds of different aspects of bacterial pathogenesis. So it was really a great opportunity. So after leaving that, I really liked my time at Rutgers, but was always kind of interested in exploring a potential role in industry. And I thought maybe being a postdoc at a company would be a good way to see what a job in a pharmaceutical company would be like. And so I started a postdoctoral fellowship at Regeneron Pharmaceuticals. So there I worked in the infectious disease department, stuck with infectious diseases, and was really interested in looking at ways that we could maybe direct immune proteins to different pathogens or tumor cells to help kill them. So you have proteins in your body that can recognize foreign pathogens and lead to their destruction. And we were looking to see if we could direct those to high levels to pathogens to help clear them more efficiently. And then last year I finished my postdoc and transitioned to a different role at Regeneron, where I'm kind of screening large numbers of potential therapeutics to see which ones might be the best. So we might have 1,000 different proteins that could be a potential drug, but we only want to come up with the top 4 or 5 that you might want to pursue farther. And so that's my role now to kind of help develop assays that would narrow that down. And so, in my free time, I've enjoyed hiking and traveling and spending time with my dogs. So that's a little bit of background on how I got here. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to ask them during it, or save them for the end, whichever you prefer. So without any more ado, I'll get actually to the topic of the rest of the talk, which is going to be on infectious diseases and food security. And infectious diseases can really have a big impact on food security and food safety. They can be caused by a variety of different agents, whether they're bacteria, viruses, parasites, or these things called prions, which are misfolded proteins. And not only can they affect food itself, but they can also impact the ability of workers to produce food. So they can limit how much food is available, either by preventing processing or the production of produce or other items. And so right now, obviously, we're hearing a lot about infectious diseases with the coronavirus outbreak, but they affect us every day beyond that as well. And so here's just a few examples of recent outbreaks just from the last year that have caused recalls. So this lower headline was from the FDA about an outbreak of a parasite called Cyclospora, which infected vegetables and led to a recall. E. coli can also contaminate lettuce and lead to different issues. And not only does this occur in the US, but this was an outbreak of norovirus in China that led to an outbreak in delivered food. So this impacts the entire world and causes disease all the time. And so my goals for today are really just to run through some of these common different foodborne pathogens and let you know how they might impact food safety and also how they might be controlled. And also show you how these pathogens can reduce food availability through recalls, or how other pathogens, not just foodborne pathogens, but pathogens in general, such as coronavirus, can alter productivity and really impact food availability. So these are some terms you probably have heard over the last couple of weeks, but just to reiterate in this context, people use terms like food safety and food security a lot, and they have even though they're similar, they do have slightly different meanings, especially in this context. So generally, when we talk about food safety, we're talking about the quality, having food that's safe from physical, chemical, or biological contaminants. So making sure there's not plastic in your food, that there's not toxins, that there aren't any bacteria that could cause illness. That's a very important part of food safety, and infectious diseases play a big role in that. But then there's also the concept of food security, which is very important in terms of having access and availability to safe and nutritious foods in the quantities that society needs. And so I'll be touching on food safety predominantly in the beginning and talking about these different pathogens that can affect food, but then also talking about food security and how these pathogens can limit food availability. So just a few questions before we begin. I'll try and make this into a poll. See if I can launch it. Okay, I'm having, is it possible for you to launch the poll? I'm trying problems.
Yep, I can go ahead and launch.
All right,
no
great,
worries.
thanks.
Yep.
All right, so we're going to launch a poll just to ask you, just to give you an idea of, ask some questions about the scope of different foodborne illnesses. So the first question is, worldwide, how many people do you think get foodborne illnesses each year? Is it 500,000, 20 million, 600 million, or 5 billion? So I'll let you guys answer these. I'll run through all of the questions and you can just answer them as I go, and then we'll go over the answers. So on average, how many food recalls are there each year in the US? 75, 700, 5,000, or 25,000? And then some true or false questions. So true or false, are parasitic infections rare in the United States? True or false, our food recalls can involve millions of pounds of food? And true or false, foodborne illnesses never cause serious complications? So I'll give you a few minutes just to think about that and answer those questions. I'll just get an idea of how widespread and what kind of impact foodborne infections can have.
We see a lot of answers coming in so far, and some of the questions that you asked, John, I see some students are choosing several answers, so I can't say that one specific answer is really the one drawing the most, but I see question number 4. It seems like everyone knows the right answer for that one.
That one seemed, yeah, food recalls can be very, very large. So I'll kind of go through these. I guess I was just waiting for a few more replies.
Yes,
So
yes, I'm waiting for 3 more folks to just answer the poll question, and I'll let you know once you can move forward. We'll give them maybe an extra 30 seconds or more.
Sure. Yeah, so it's kind of interesting just seeing some of the trends. It looks like, I mean, there was two big answers for the first one. Kind of two of them led the way.
Yeah, it seems like number 4, definitely everyone answered the right question. And I see number 5. All right, I see one more person just finished. So we're just waiting for 2 others.
Yeah.
So
Getting there.
we're almost there. But just going back to your presentation, John, could you tell us where you took that picture with the falls, the waterfalls in the back?
Sure. So that was actually in Norway. So there was a conference
Nice.
there. So I got to travel over to Norway, attend a conference, and then spend a little time beforehand, hiking. So, scientific conferences are kind of a fun part. You get to meet a lot of different people. We also get to go different places. So it's been an interesting part of the job that I've really enjoyed.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's really great to know that you're able to travel and see such beautiful places for work, right?
Yeah, which has been great, and you kind of take a little time off before or after, kind of explore a little bit more. But a
Right.
lot of the conferences, they'll kind of let you, kind of tell you about the area or have some kind of cultural excursion during the conference to get a feel for, just whether it's the food of the area or interesting sites around the area.
No, that's really good for the students to know and understand that even in your career as a scientist, that you still can do, travel and do a lot of fun things even through your profession. It doesn't always mean, it doesn't always mean that you're always in a lab, right? Just like doing different, doing work and experimenting. You're stepping out. You're able to explore and try new things. So that's wonderful for the students to hear. So we're waiting for one more person to vote. So again, everyone, we're just going to give you another like 20 more seconds to vote. If you have not yet voted, please feel free to just look at the front of your screen. You should be able to see a pop-up that says polls. So we're going to give you another 10 more seconds, and hopefully the last person can just go ahead and submit their votes.
We're waiting for that tiebreaker on question 1. It's 4-4.
Yeah, yeah, me too.
And question 3.
Yep. All right, so maybe we could just go ahead and end the polling. I don't know if maybe the last person maybe walked away from their computer. So, oh, there we go.
All right. So the first question is how many people get foodborne illnesses each year? And the answer is 600 million. So it's about 1 in 10 people worldwide end up getting a foodborne infection each year. And those are just the reported cases. So a lot goes unreported. So that number might be even larger. On average, there are 700. So the recalls each year in the US. So that was the number 1 answer for question 2. So there are quite a few recalls. Some of them deal with food, some of them deal with allergens or other contaminants that might be in food. So the next question is, I guess can be a little tough because it depends on what you count as rare, but it's actually estimated for one of the parasite we'll talk about a little bit later, is that there can be actually about 40 million people infected with this one type of parasite called toxoplasma in the US. So it's not as rare as you might think. Everyone was correct that food recalls can involve millions and even tens of millions of pounds of food. And most people were said false for that foodborne illnesses can cause very severe disease, even leading up to death. So it can cause some very severe outcomes. All right, so now that we've gotten through the quick poll, let's go through, just a few facts. Kind of, we touched on this a little bit already, but the World Health Organization estimates that about 600 million people get foodborne infections each year. And they can also estimate this, not just in terms of number of people, but in terms of how many healthy life years are lost. So if someone is sick for a week, that would count as a week for life years. And so it's actually about 33 million life years every year are affected by foodborne illness. So it's a major issue worldwide. And what really stands out is that there's 420,000 deaths, and about a third of those are in children 5 or younger. So they're very susceptible to foodborne illness, and also some of the loss of nutrients that can occur once you do get sick with foodborne illnesses. And then if you look at that, particularly at just looking at the United States, there's about 48 million infections each year, 120,000 hospitalizations, and 3,000 deaths. And just something interesting to note is that the CDC kind of breaks this up by what organism caused the infection. And there's 31 pathogens that have been well described to cause infections, and they account for about 9.4 million of those illnesses. But if you look, the large majority of that, about 38 million infections, actually have an unspecified agent. So it could be one of these 31 known pathogens, but it hasn't been tested for. So a lot of people get sick quickly and then recover, and so the causative agent of their illness isn't known. But it's still a large number of infections, 48 million infections. And so people can break down types of foodborne illnesses into two main groups. There's food infections, which are caused by bacteria, viruses, and parasites actually infecting you. So if you ingested food that was contaminated, these organisms could get into your intestinal tract and cause an infection as they replicate. And they can spread from person to person. And because the bacteria or virus are dividing and replicating, generally it takes a little bit of time for you to get sick, anywhere from hours to days or weeks. And it results in what you would normally associate with a foodborne infection: nausea, vomiting, diarrhea. But there's also food intoxication. So if food isn't handled properly or prepared properly, organisms can grow in that food and produce toxins. The toxins themselves can cause illness. They're not communicable because just the toxins, but they can also cause disease much quicker. So normally the incubation time is minutes to hours. And these can result in those normal foodborne illness type symptoms that were similar to the food infections, but it can also lead to some respiratory and neurological symptoms as well. All right, so now I was going to run through a few common foodborne pathogens just to give you an idea of what agents might cause disease in the U.S. as well as worldwide. So E. coli or Escherichia E. coli is something you might have heard of before. I mean, it's a common bacteria that's found in labs. People use it for a variety of different experiments, and you can use it to learn a lot about different biological processes. But can also be found in the guts of human and animals. And most strains are completely harmless. They don't cause any disease. But bacteria have this ability to pick up different DNA. So they can pick it up from different bacteria. They can just take it up from the environment. And certain strains of E. coli have picked up pieces of DNA that code for toxins. And so there's strains called enterotoxigenic E. coli, or ETEC for short. If you decide to pick infectious diseases and you're looking up different types of E. coli, you'll see a lot of them get abbreviated as ETEC or STEC, or it just stands for a different type of toxin producing, and then EC for E. coli. And so these E. coli produce a toxin that results in traveler's diarrhea. So a lot of people who travel can end up getting sick. It involves in millions of people worldwide, infections worldwide, and leads to thousands of deaths, mainly in the developing world. And there's also another strain of E. coli called Shiga toxin producing E. coli, or STEC, that produce, so this includes E. coli 0157H7, which is something you might have heard of. It's caused a number of outbreaks and recalls in recent years. And this can cause a bit more severe symptoms. The toxins that it can produce can actually affect your kidneys and lead to kidney failure and death. And it's estimated that there are about 350,000 cases of this of E. coli infection in the US alone. I just kind of give you a little rundown of how that could occur. These organisms are normally present in the digestive tracts of animals such as cows. And so if you were to eat milk, or drink milk, or eat meat that was contaminated with it and didn't cook that meat properly, you could then ingest the bacteria. In recent years, there's also been a number of outbreaks that have come from produce that was infected. So if these cows are grazing in pastures that are upstream or near areas where produce is produced, that the wastewater from the cows can then pass through the waste into the soil, through the water into these plants. And so a number of outbreaks have been linked to lettuce and other produce that were contaminated from animals. And so if those food items aren't heated properly, so the bacteria are readily killed if you cook to about 160 degrees. But if the food isn't heated properly, then you can ingest those bacteria and end up getting symptoms. And so this has caused a number of outbreaks, even just in the US. So this is just a quick list of, some as recently as last month, where there is a number of infections linked to romaine lettuce. So if you look at a few of these recent outbreaks have all been linked to romaine lettuce that have sickened, dozens to a few hundred people in a number of states as this a lot of produce now gets shipped across the country and globally, these outbreaks can spread rather quickly. There was a well-reported outbreak in 2015 that was linked to Chipotle that sickened a number of people in different states and led to 22 hospitalizations. And then this was just a very large outbreak that happened in Germany, that was centered in Germany, but really affected a number of countries throughout Europe. And this was linked to these bean sprouts that were again contaminated with E. coli, and that led to quite a few deaths. And actually was, in terms of these infections, can have a large impact on food availability and a huge economic impact on food producers. So it was estimated that there were about hundreds of millions of dollars worth of crops that were lost, and several billion dollars in lost productivity just to this one outbreak. So these outbreaks not only can sicken large number of people, but really can reduce the amount of food availability and have an impact on food producers. And the initial outbreaks of E. coli 157H7 were actually linked mostly to ground beef. And so that's what kind of surprised people, as some of these later ones were more linked to produce. But these early outbreaks, so in 2002, was linked to ground beef that led to 7 hospitalizations, resulted in 19 million pounds of ground beef being recalled. So it was a large amount of food had to be destroyed because it was potentially contaminated. And one of the earliest real nation stories that really got national attention in terms of foodborne infections was this 1993 Jack-in-the-Box outbreak that left 4 people dead, several younger people as well, and so it really got made national headlines. So if you have any questions about E. coli, again, feel free to ask any questions you have as I go along, or there'll be time at the end as well. So the next bacteria I was going to talk about was Salmonella, which has some similarities in terms of the disease that, some of the symptoms to E. coli. Similarly, it's also found in the intestinal tract of many animals, but if it gets into food, it can cause severe disease. So it's estimated to cause 90 million infections each year. So it's a large number of people that get infected and about 150,000 deaths. And you can see just in the map below that these deaths, there's quite a few number of incidents in the US. So this shows that there's about 2 incidents per 100,000. It's also the number 2 most common foodborne disease in Europe, but there's a huge number of cases in Africa and Southeast Asia. So not only is this a problem in the US and Europe, but it's also a large problem in other parts of the world as well. And just like similar to the E. coli, this bacteria, once you ingest it, is able to get into your small intestine and cause inflammation. That leads to the symptoms that can include vomiting, fever, and abdominal cramps. In a lot of cases, your immune system is able to eventually fight off the bacteria and the case will resolve. But if the symptoms get severe enough, diarrhea can lead to dehydration, which can become severe. And if the bacteria can leave the bloodstream, then it can cause a more global infection called sepsis, and that can be very, very severe. So currently, the good thing about a lot of these bacteria is they can be treated with antibiotics. And in some countries, people are actually working to vaccinate the animals. So one control mechanism is to reduce how much bacteria the animals have on them, and then that will reduce the amount that people get. And so in the UK, they're working to vaccinate chickens, and so it'll lower the rate of contamination of their chickens so that people get less disease. And again, just like E. coli, this caused a number of very, very large outbreaks. So these are just some of the outbreaks that have been caused in recent years due to Salmonella. I just kind of wanted to point out just how many people can get infected by these 900 illnesses, and just also the amount of food that can be affected. So in this case, millions of pounds of ground turkey had to be recalled. Or in 2010, an outbreak linked to fresh eggs resulted in the recall of over 500 million eggs. So this is a lot of food that could be going to consumers that has to get sent back. So it's really reducing food availability and not only affecting food safety in terms of how safe the food is that people have, but also food security in terms of what food is available. And then in 2009, this case was just a little bit different as well. This was a larger outbreak, but what was notable was that the company ended up closing. It went bankrupt after this outbreak due to the recall, and the CEO was actually sentenced to jail for, I believe, 28 years in connection with this, not only for the outbreak, but then subsequent cover-ups and emails that they were still sending out food even though they knew it was contaminated. So this can have severe ramifications for food producers. And it turns out that at least what people know of at least is the largest foodborne outbreak in the US was actually linked to salmonella in the early 90s when there was a shipment of ice cream that was contaminated with raw eggs. So this can cause very, very large outbreaks. Right, so
John, if you don't mind, I see a question came in for you on the chat.
Sure.
Actually, two now. If you'd like to maybe address them now, unless maybe some of these answers are going to come up. So Gianna's asking, does E. coli make the cows sick, and does salmonella make chickens sick? How do you know if the animals are infected?
Sure. So some of the strains can make the animals sick, but sometimes the animals can carry those strains without any real notable signs or symptoms. So what people do is, and something I will touch on in a later slide a little bit, is for different parasites, is that government agencies can do a lot of testing. And so having better conditions on some of these farms can reduce the carriage of these bacteria. One issue that has some controversy is the widespread use of antibiotics. So antibiotics are widely used in the food industry to kind of reduce infections and reduce carriage of some of these organisms. There's some concern that because of its widespread use, it can enhance antibiotic resistance and pathogens for humans. So there's work now being done to figure out ways how to keep these animals not having these pathogens without using large amounts of antibiotics. So having better conditions on the farm, and then government agencies will also test a lot. So having high testing can help you find, are there these pathogens on different farms? Sadly, sometimes it still gets through, and then the only way you find out is, once there is an outbreak, tracing that outbreak back through the production line and through the food supply line back to the source. That's a great question.
So you have, it seems that the students are very intrigued by salmonella and E. coli. And
Sure.
One student wants you to just kind of review the differences a little bit more. If you can just provide a little more clarity between the two. They seem to kind of have a little bit of confusion. So they want you to review that information again, if possible.
So in some ways, they're both bacteria. So they do have some similarities. They're both bacteria agents. They're actually similar. They're not all that in terms of bacteria, they have some similarities. And the diseases that they cause can be somewhat similar. Some of the symptoms are, the vomiting, fever, diarrhea are kind of similar between the two of them. E. coli is kind of notable. So I'll kind of go back to this slide, in that a lot of them have picked up these different toxins. And so E. coli 0157H7 is one in particular that's become a big concern because it's led to a lot of outbreaks. So it's what makes it a little bit different is it's toxin that can actually affect your blood cells. And since your kidneys have a lot of kind of narrow vessels in them, that can then lead to kidney failure and death. So that's kind of what puts these Shiga toxin producing E. coli strains a little bit different. Salmonella, again, somewhat similar in terms of how it infects you, coming from animals, and then growing in your intestine, leading to inflammation. Tends not to produce like the Shiga toxin type strains, but just its growth in general can lead to inflammation in your intestines, just as it replicates and grows. And then that itself can then lead to similar symptoms, just to kind of a different cause. So a lot of the bacteria do have similar symptoms. That's actually what makes, as what I kind of pointed out on one of the earlier slides, is that there's 38 or so million cases where an agent that causes the disease isn't known. That's one of the issues, that a lot of these foodborne illnesses have similar symptoms. So it can be kind of hard just based on symptoms without testing to kind of pinpoint what the actual causative agent is. I hope that answered quite. If you want any more, I can kind of go into anything in more depth.
Right now, we don't have any other questions. So I did tell the students to feel free to share any additional questions through the chat box. So maybe we'll get some as you continue your presentation, but thank you, John.
Yeah, sounds good. Great questions. Keep them coming. All right, so I was going to go through two or three more bacteria, and then I'll switch over to some viruses. So I picked out a few other ones that caused a lot of infection throughout the world. And there's a lot of other foodborne bacteria. These were just some of the ones that cause more infection. But if you decide to pick infectious diseases, there's also a lot more bacteria to look into as well. But one bacteria that causes a lot of infection worldwide, not as much in the US, but a lot in tropical areas of the world, is Vibrio cholera. So this is kind of found a lot in saltwater and can attach to shellfish. So people tend to get it if their water supply isn't safe, or if they've improperly cooked shellfish or other things from the ocean. But it's estimated to cause about 1.5 to 4 million cases worldwide, and about 150,000 deaths. And the thing, it's a very acute disease, so it tends to happen very quickly. And normally, if you just drink enough water, you tend to can actually overcome the disease. What it normally causes is just very severe diarrhea, so much so that you can dehydrate within hours. So most cases, as long as you just get enough water and you replace electrolytes, so salts and sugars that you lose, you'd be okay. Unfortunately, in some areas, as you try and rehydrate, you just contaminate yourself more with the same bacteria, and you can't rehydrate quick enough. So really having a supply of safe water and properly cooking shellfish is enough to reduce this bacteria a lot. What's interesting is it can occur both endemically, which means it's just kind of native to that area. So in some parts of the world, especially in more tropical areas where the water is a bit warmer, it's just endemically there. And so the bacteria is kind of there all the time, and you just always have to take precautions. But in other cases, it tends to, to form more epidemically. You can have these epidemics, or these kind of all of a sudden bursts of infections that can span years. So between 2016 and 2018, there was a 2-year-long outbreak in Yemen, so right around in the Middle East, that resulted in 1 million infections and 2,500 deaths. And so these things can become quite large. All right, and then I'll move on. So these bacteria are a little bit different. So I'm kind of, the Salmonella and E. coli were more similar. These now are causing somewhat different diseases. So Listeria, I just kind of picked to go over, not because it causes a lot of disease, but because it causes very severe disease. So Listeria is a little bit different than these other organisms in that not only can it grow outside of a host, but it can actually, it grows inside the cells of the host. So after you eat contaminated, normally it's associated with contaminated meat and dairy products, the bacteria grow inside your own cells, and it can cause a very high mortality rate of about 20 to 30%. So this graph on the bottom just shows organisms that are associated with food outbreaks. So these are just some common organisms. Norovirus I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But this just shows, this darker blue line shows how many outbreaks are associated with each organism. This light blue line shows the percentage of illness associated with this. So this particular virus called norovirus, which we'll talk about a little bit later, causes about 45% of all the foodborne associated illness in the US. So it's a really large number, but it only is responsible for about 5% of the deaths. And then Salmonella, which we talked about earlier, causes about 30% of all the illnesses and 20% of all of the deaths. And then here is the Shiga toxin producing E. coli, 3% of the illnesses and 9% of the deaths. But what makes Listeria kind of interesting is that it causes a fraction of a percent of all the foodborne illnesses in the United States, but it accounts for about 52% of all of the deaths. So it has a very, very high mortality rate. So even though it doesn't cause a lot of infection, people have been very careful to make sure that if there's any potential for contamination, that food is recalled, just so that infections don't occur. The other thing that makes this bacterial a bit noteworthy is, in terms of control, it can grow at low temperature. So later on, I'll talk about some ways that people can handle food properly and treat food properly to prevent infection. But this organism can grow at low temperatures, so it can get around some of those mechanisms. And it can cause more severe disease, including sepsis and meningitis, and even death. And there have been some large outbreaks. So in South Africa, this isn't only an issue in the US. In South Africa, there was a large outbreak that led to 1,000 infections and 216 deaths. And then again, as I mentioned, even though it doesn't cause a lot of infections in the US, just because it can cause so much death, 15 million pounds of meat were recalled after a potential contamination in 1998. So it can really have a large impact on the food supply. And then one last bacteria, again, just very different from the other ones we've talked about so far, are these Clostridium species. So maybe you've heard of these, you've heard of Botox or botulinum toxin, so that people can use to reduce wrinkles. but what it comes from is this bacterium Clostridium botulinum and some other, it has closely related bacteria called Clostridium perfringens and difficile that can all cause foodborne illness. And what makes these bacteria notable is that they form spores. So most bacteria that we kind of mentioned with E. coli and Salmonella, if you cook your food properly, tends to destroy the bacteria. But these spores are able to survive under really harsh conditions. So things that would normally kill a bacteria, the spore will still be able to survive. And they tend to grow in foods with that are called anaerobic. So it means it's lacking oxygen. So if you have like a canned food that doesn't have any access to air, these bacteria might survive in it. So people really make sure to heat their cans, and when they're processing food, those kinds of food quite well to make sure these spores have been killed. And again, there's not many cases in each year in the United States, but when there are, especially for Clostridium botulinum, it produces a very potent neurotoxin. So most of your neurons, you have these molecules, these neurotransmitters that are secreted and then move to the next neuron, and that's what it allows an electrical impulse to be signaled and a neuron to transmit a signal. The botulinum toxin actually blocks this from occurring very, very potently. And so it can ultimately lead to paralysis. And in severe cases, if the muscles around your lungs are paralyzed, then you can stop breathing and can lead to death that way. So those are some of the bacteria. There's other bacteria that cause foodborne infections. I would just kind of went over those as just kind of a brief overview of some of the different organisms that might infect different parts of the world. And now I was going to move on to a few viruses. So if you had any questions about the bacteria, you can ask it now, later.
So John, we did have one student who just wanted you to go back to the slide where you listed kind of all of the years in terms of, I think it was outbreaks. Yeah, yes, throughout. Is this, so Emily, if you can feel free to just send me a quick message if this is the slide that you wanted John to go back to. And again, if you have any specific question on this slide, yes, so Emily just confirmed, she just sent me a quick note that this is the slide she wanted you to go back to. So Emily, if you have any specific questions about this slide, please let John know.
Sorry, no, I just wanted to copy down that because I thought 2009 was very interesting, where contaminated peanut butter from Peanut Butter Corporation of America led to 714 infections and 9 deaths.
Yeah, so that was a big outbreak, and so that was kind of interesting that company ended up, closing after that outbreak because of the economic impact, and the CEO tried to cover up some of the infection, or pushed for food to continue to be distributed even though it was known to be contaminated, and so was sentenced to jail. So these outbreaks, even if this might not have been the largest outbreak, but or recall, but they can have severe economic ramifications for the company and consequences for people who don't try and stop them. Yeah, and these are just some of and also one other note is these are just some of the outbreaks. These are some of the bigger ones. There's been other recalls linked to Salmonella in the US and throughout the world. This was just kind of some more notable ones.
Thank you so much, John. I think it's, everything that you're going through, everything that you're explaining and showcasing to our students is pretty important, because I don't think students often really understand much about infectious diseases or the differences between like a virus or an infection and the impact that it has on the immune system. So I think they're definitely, I'm walking away learning a lot already, so.
Yeah, so now we're going to switch to viruses. So bacteria are single cell organisms, so they're very small. Bacteria aren't even cells. So these are just, very, very small things such as coronavirus that is causing infection now. And they're really, all they are is just a piece of genetic material and some protein to transmit it from one cell to the next. And so these can be very infectious and can spread very quickly, as we're seeing with the coronavirus. And so norovirus, you might have heard on cruise ships. So there's been several notable outbreaks on different cruise ships, and it's also very, very contagious. So it is a foodborne virus, so it can be found in food and water, but it can also be just transmitted directly person to person or on contaminated surfaces. And so this is the most common foodborne illness in the United States in terms of just number of infections, and also one of the most notable in the entire world. So if you just look at all routes of infection, both foodborne and person-to-person or via contaminated surfaces, there's over 500 million cases each year and 200,000 deaths. And it accounts for about half of all the foodborne infections in the US each year. So it's very contagious, very easy to spread. And oftentimes on cruise ships, you'll hear of, people being quarantined or just because to prevent these outbreaks from getting any bigger. But like a lot of these other foodborne illnesses, proper heating can inactivate the virus. And it's also, one unfortunate thing is if you try and decontaminate surfaces, it can be resistant to certain disinfectants. But if you just make sure the food is cooked properly, then that can at least limit the foodborne aspect of it. And you can see this is kind of widespread in the US, in Russia, in Europe, throughout the world, there's a lot of cases of norovirus. So one other virus I just wanted to kind of point out was hepatitis, so a little bit different. So again, another virus, not a bacteria, so a little bit smaller. This can also spread through food and drinking water. And one interesting kind of thing to note with this is that it can really lead to problems with your liver. So the virus can get into liver cells and cause issues, ultimately leading to liver failure and death if it's not treated. But in a lot of cases, your immune system is able to detect the virus and kind of keep it asymptomatic. So in the cases where it can't, there's about 1.4 million symptomatic cases each year and 7,500 deaths. And one of the main symptoms, or at least the most notable symptom, is jaundice. And so jaundice is a condition that's been linked to a variety of different infections. And it's just where your liver normally breaks down this substance called bilirubin, which is just something that your body produces. If that accumulates, it kind of has a yellowish tint to it. And so if it accumulates in your skin can kind of have a yellow tone to it, and also the whites of your eyes. The one good thing about this, and so we're kind of hearing about that a lot today with the coronavirus vaccine, is that infections with this virus lead to really strong immunity. So once your body sees this, it recognizes that this virus is foreign, it needs to be eliminated, and your body can then quickly, if you get exposed to it again, develop an immune response to it. And so that allows for a very effective vaccine to be produced. And so there is a hepatitis A vaccine, and that helps to reduce the numbers. Generally in the US, there aren't a lot of cases, so most people don't get the hepatitis A vaccine if you're in the country. There's also other forms of hepatitis you might have heard of. So there's a hepatitis B vaccine. They're different viruses, spread different ways, but at least for this foodborne one, not as common in the US, although there are cases. And so this is just to show you that, yeah, it's very low prevalence in the US and Western Europe. There are higher cases in South America, Africa, and Asia. Any questions on any of the viruses? All right, so one last class of, not to give you too many different types of pathogens, but one last big group that affects a lot of people are parasites. And so parasites are really diverse. They're also a lot more complicated. So we talked about bacteria, which are just single, very simple cells. Viruses, which aren't even cells. They're just mix a bit of genetic material and some protein to get them from one cell to the next. And now we go to parasites. So these can be protozoa, or they can be worms, which are multicellular organisms. They have very complex life cycles. So, every different parasite has a different life cycle. As you get to know them, see more of them, maybe it becomes more interesting. This was just to show you, you have to know every single step, but just that it's a lot more complex. They infect multiple different organisms. They have different growth stages. They do a whole bunch of different things. So they can be a little bit more difficult both to eliminate, and since they're more complicated and more similar cells to human cells, and they can sometimes be a little bit more difficult to treat. So the first one I was going to talk about was Toxoplasma gondii. And I was really going to talk about this one because it's somewhat common in the United States. At least it's estimated to be. So this is a single-celled protozoan that can infect a whole bunch of different animals, both mammals and birds. But its definitive host, so the host that it can actually replicate in and undergo all of its life stages in, is cats. And so humans can become infected with this organism after contaminating food and water. If their cat is defecated near any food or water, or they picked it up in some way, they can become contaminated. And it's estimated that about 40 million people in the US can produce an immune response to it. So they might not directly have the infection, but at least if you looked at their immune response, it seems that their immune system has seen this organism. And again, just like hepatitis, a lot of people are able to control this infection and there's no symptoms. But in cases where there's immune compromise, their immune system is compromised. So if people end up with advanced HIV and that'll lower your immune system, or in terms of food security, if you're malnourished, that can lower your immune system. Then you can start to develop some symptoms, including fever, also muscle aches. If you're pregnant, there can be some complications with that as well. And again, a common theme we've seen with a lot of these foodborne illnesses is that heating, in this case freezing as well, can really destroy the cysts of this organism and eliminate it. All right, so now we're going to get to two more worms, and that's it for the different diseases that I was going to go through today. So the first one is roundworm. Maybe you've heard of it. It got a lot of publicity at one point. It's kind of gone down in number of cases. So trichinella is a pork roundworm. It infects a number of game animals, but it's really notable for infecting pigs. And so the pigs can eat this eggs of this worm in the soil, and the worm is able to kind of get into the muscles of the pig. And if a person ate it, they could then become contaminated. So there's not a huge number of cases worldwide. It's 10,000 cases. I just kind of wanted, what was interesting about this is just how the cases have dropped in the United States. So if you look at the graph on the right, this is just showing the number of cases associated with pork each year in the United States from the mid-70s up until the 2000s. And you can see that this number, especially the pork cases, have dropped considerably, almost to zero. And there's still a few, but not many, just really through having better conditions on pig farms, so the pigs don't carry as much of the worms, better food inspection practices, and also just increased awareness of the disease. So people, having a campaign of public health and telling people to properly cook their pork has really helped reduce the numbers. In fact, in the US, really it's maybe some of the game meat that's not being properly cooked that's really responsible for the cases now. It's not so much from pork. So we kind of touched on in that earlier question, just having inspection to make sure that food isn't contaminated is a great way to see if things, if there's going to be infection, and having good public health and raising awareness about these different diseases can really drop the number of infections. And so again, another thing, just kind of linking that to what we're seeing now with coronavirus, is that having good public health in terms of getting people to social distance, to wear masks, can really help to curb some diseases. Can really have a big impact. All right, and then one last foodborne infection is two worms that are similar. These are tapeworms. They can either infect pigs, so there's a pork tapeworm, or beef, so there's a beef tapeworm. And they can infect different animals. But again, now this time, the definitive host, so the host where it undergoes this really complicated life cycle, is in humans. So eggs can be found in the soil and can be eaten by pigs and cattle. If the meat isn't properly cooked, it can then be transmitted to humans. Again, just like in a lot of these cases, they can live in the intestine for decades, really without many symptoms. It can lead to malnutrition and can lead to some vision issues, and especially in parts of the world where food security is a big issue and access to nutritious food isn't as common, it can really lead to some malnutrition problems. And so 50 million people are infected each year worldwide. Even if there's only 50,000 deaths, which is less than some of the other infections, it can actually lead to a large amount of lost productivity. Just as people are infected, they're not getting the nutrition they need because it's going to the worms instead, and they're not able to get to work to contribute, whether it's producing food or other items, to society. And there are cases in the US each year, but they're almost all imported. So there's really not many cases. There's not much of it seen in the US. Between proper cooking and inspection, this really isn't seen much in the US or parts of Europe. So any question, that was the organisms. So we've gone through bacteria, we've gone through quite a few organisms, different bacteria, viruses, parasites. I was going to kind of wrap up with just how we can control these things. So we've seen a wide array of different pathogens. But what's interesting is that a few simple steps can really control a lot of this. So just thoroughly cleaning your hands and the surfaces that you're going to be preparing foods on has a huge impact. Making sure that the raw food, which could be contaminated, stays separate from the prepared food that's been cooked and should be free of any organism. That really reduces the number of infections. As we've talked about with a few of these pathogens, temperature really leads to a loss in viability. So a lot of the bacteria and parasites and viruses are killed by high temperature. So thorough cooking or in dairy products, pasteurization reduces infection, and then just storing the food properly. So a lot of organisms don't grow at low temperature. So once they get to about 4 degrees, they stop growing. So that was the one notable exception was Listeria. So just keeping food out of this 40 degree to 140 degree range. So making sure it's cooked at high temperature. And then if you need to store it, dropping that temperature quickly reduces a lot of possible contamination. And so in areas where it's harder to get to certain temperatures, that can also lead to, is a consideration for, why there might be more foodborne infections. And so really making sure you have proper food inspection and safe water further reduces that risk of large scale outbreaks. All right, so then just a few last things to maybe point more now to the food security aspect rather than just the food safety. So we've seen that, bacteria and viruses and parasites can limit food safety. They can infect food and make it unsafe to eat. But the recalls can then affect food availability. So this is just a chart showing each year of the number of recalls in the US. And you can see there's, it peaked at in 2016, about 900 recalls. Not all of them are due to microorganisms. They could also be due to allergens, inaccurate labeling, physical contaminants like pieces of plastic or glass in the food. But it does result in the recalls of large amounts of food. So this is just a graph showing some number of recalls for different foodborne illnesses. You can see, as I mentioned, Listeria, even though it doesn't cause a large number of cases, because it can be so severe, has led to a large number of recalls. But E. coli and Salmonella also leads to quite a few. This is for each 3-month period in 2019. And there's very strict guidelines in the US, Europe, and parts of Asia for food safety. And so there tends to be more information available about different recalls. But it can also occur in other parts of the world. It might just be harder to obtain information on it. And these recalls really affect the producers in terms of direct costs, in terms of having to get that food back, not being able to sell the food. Now it's not available for consumers. It can also hurt brands by damaging their reputation, which happened with that peanut company. It lost so much money in terms of food and lawsuits that it then eventually closed. And this occurs throughout the world. So it's it's estimated that this can have huge economic impacts on food producers, and the World Health Organization estimates that about, just in low and middle income countries, about $110 billion is lost each year in food, which is a really large number in some of these countries. And another way we kind of touched on earlier that these diseases can be measured is in something called disability adjusted life years, or DALYs. So this is just a measure of how much quality of life without disability is lost to an illness. It could be for a foodborne illness, it could be for any illness. But just looking at foodborne illnesses alone, it's about 33 million each year. And the highest burden is really in East and West Africa, North Africa and the Middle East, and then parts of Asia and South America. And this just breaks it down by, whether there are different diarrheal diseases like norovirus we talked about, whether they're invasive diseases like Salmonella and E. coli, or whether they're helminths, which is just a fancy name for worms. So you can see these diarrheal diseases have a huge impact on productivity each year. And if people who work in food processing plants are getting sick, then they can't process food. And just in the last couple of minutes, this is just one quick example just from this year about how infectious diseases can affect food production. So this is just from earlier this year and just in the United States from coronavirus. So obviously earlier in this year, as there were many, many cases of coronaviruses, certain areas were getting hit very hard. And one place that seemed to have a lot of infections was in food processing plants, in particular meat packing plants. So these tend to be very labor intensive productions. People are kind of close together. So it's an ideal spot to spread something like coronavirus. And because of that, quite a few meat pack plants had to be shut down. And so that limited the amount of food that was available in the US. Luckily, there were other plants to kind of pick up some of that slack, but it did impact food supplies in terms of how much food was available. Coronaviruses and other pandemics can also affect imports and exports of food, which can limit food's availability in different parts of the world. And then just the unemployment that can result from different infections. So whether it's coronavirus leading to jobs going away and more unemployment, or if someone gets sick with a different virus or a different debilitating illness and then can't work, that increase in poverty can decrease the amount of food that's available and then have an impact on food security. So this is just one last slide, just to kind of give you something to kind of think about as a takeaway. That so far I've really been talking about how infectious diseases can impact food security, but it's a two-way street. They're interconnected. Having access to safe and nutritious food can boost your immune system and actually reduce the risk of infectious diseases. So, having good agriculture and production can decrease infectious diseases. Agricultural production also tends to need a lot of infrastructure. So you need good water, you need roads and a lot to carry this around. And so that infrastructure development can be associated with better sanitation and better access to safe water, which will decrease infectious diseases. Unfortunately, food production can also mean conversion of natural habitats to farmland and dams for irrigation. So that can increase reservoir habitats for disease reservoirs like mosquitoes. And so that's happened in certain areas of the world. A dam will be built and then mosquito-borne illness will increase. It can also lead to more contact between farm animals, humans, and wild animals, which might mean more of zoonoses emerge. So zoonoses is just a fancy word for diseases that have been transmitted from animals to humans. And so, as we need more food as the population grows and there's more agricultural production, that can have both a positive and negative on infectious diseases. Being able to supply the world with safe, nutritious food can boost immune systems and reduce risk for infection, but can also lead to changing habitats that might increase the risk for infections to spread. And so just in summary, I went over a few of the ways that infectious diseases can have a tremendous impact on food security, but there's other illnesses and other diseases that can also impact food security as well. It can be caused by a variety of different pathogens, whether it be bacteria, viruses, parasites, prions, which were part of mad cow disease, which was got a lot of attention in the 1990s and the early 2000s. This contamination can not only make the food unsafe, but also just limit the amount of food that's available through recalls. And it can decrease worker productivity, leading to less food production. And there's really a complex relationship and interplay between food security, human health, and infectious diseases. And all of these are intertwined and interconnected. So as you impact one, you're going to impact the others. And so with that, if anyone has any other questions about anything I presented, I'd be happy to answer them.
Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much, John. I think your presentation was so thorough and through and was so insightful and informative. And it's great to see that you're a product of our school, product of Rutgers, and that you're doing such amazing work that's so impactful in our communities and impact our communities every day. We do have one question from a student, and this is kind of going back to some of the things that you mentioned earlier when you were talking about infectious diseases and how you can conduct different tests to just determine to see what kind of pathogens may be found within animals. And so there was one particular student who was asking if the animals get antibiotics, if the animals get antibiotics if they get sick, and how effective is the medicine for the animals. And I'm thinking that the student also is thinking, does the antibiotic work on the animal? And also, can you elaborate on the impact that it has on the consumer who's consuming an animal that consuming food from an animal that has previously had a pathogen or has been treated with specific antibiotics or other medication?
Sure, great question. So a lot of times, some of these antibiotics, some of them are given specifically when an animal is sick. A lot of times it's just given generically to prevent infection from even occurring. So it's just as that animal is at a large scale farm, they might just get antibiotics just to prevent infections from occurring. They can also, because the animals are less sick, can boost growth. Now, instead of having to fight off an infection, if they're healthy, the animal can grow larger, faster, and so you have a bigger animal and more food. In terms of the impact that can have, I mean, for the most part, if you have a hamburger that was treated, you cooked it properly, it's not going to have a huge direct impact per se. But if you have, it can, if you ingest a lot of that, it could have some impact, and it can also lead to the development of antibiotic resistance. If you're giving out millions and millions of doses of antibiotics to farm animals, now you're going to select through natural selection for bacteria that are resistant to those antibiotics. And then, even if that might not be a human pathogen directly, they could then transmit that DNA. As I mentioned, bacteria are really good at picking up DNA either from other bacteria or from the environment. And so if one organism has the genes necessary to survive in the presence of an antibiotic, they might be able to give that to another bacteria that is a human pathogen. And now you can really push antibiotic resistance. And so that's something that's currently a bit of concern for a number of people. And there's a lot of work on trying to reduce how much antibiotics are used, not for human use, but just for agricultural uses, where there's a large amount of antibiotic use.
Thank you so much. So students, feel free to use your virtual hand raising option if you want to unmute and ask a question to myself or to John. We'd love to hear to hear more from you. I think the questions you've asked so far have been very inquisitive, and I'm glad to see that there were some coming in. But if there's anything else that you'd like us to clarify on or to provide additional information, please feel free to send that over to the chat. In the meantime, John, maybe you can share just one little bit of information just about your journey at Rutgers and the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences and your transition into your current profession. I think it'd be great for the students to, they hear a lot about the work that you do, but thinking about how this translates into a career and thinking about the majors that can lead to that, I think it would be great to make those connections if possible.
Sure, yeah. So I in high school, always kind of was interested in biology in general, kind of bounced around different ideas, always liked the idea of being a scientist, doing experiments. So that seemed pretty interesting. But then read a book in my sophomore year called The Hot Zone, which was actually about Ebola, which is kind of interesting. So at Regeneron, we have a program for a different Ebola drug, so it's kind of gone full circle. We got really interested in infectious diseases at that point. It was an interesting book about Ebola in the US. So the author, Richard Preston, has a few different books about different infectious diseases. So then kind of always was interested in that. Ended up going to Rutgers, went to the different campuses, really fell in love with Cook. It's a great campus, a lot of great professors, had a really great feel. So decided that's where I wanted to go. And didn't even really know much about food science going into Rutgers, but just had a kind of like an informational session where they had the ice cream that they make at the food science building that they had in my freshman year dorm, and found out about food microbiology and thought that was just a great, combination of food science. Still got to do some microbiology work, and there's some really interesting pathogens that are foodborne. So kind of fell in love with that there, and then slowly got exposed to different types of research. So got to see chemistry of food and food development, and then really spent most of my time in food microbiology. But just being at Rutgers, kind of getting exposed to all these different areas of science, really started to focus in more on infectious diseases. So then after that, because I liked Rutgers, wanted to kind of learn more about the immune system. As you kind of learn one area of science, you realize that you learn more and more about one thing and realize there's a lot you don't know about a whole bunch of different areas. And so just kind of always staying open was like, oh, it'd be kind of interesting to learn more about the immune system. And so then in grad school, kind of learned a little bit more about these these bacteria that have a complex relationship with hosts, and how the host and the bacteria kind of relate to each other. And the immune system tries to get rid of the bacteria have ways to survive, and kind of got to learn more about that.
Thank you so much. So I do see one hand from Christina. So Christina, you can feel free to unmute yourself and ask John your question.
Okay. Hi, my name is Christina. My question was, with vaccines for animals that you're giving them, how often are scientists trying to come up with new vaccines, especially for like I'm not sure what it was called, the
Like
or the Naira one, where it's like really popular? How often are they trying to create these viruses, and how effective are they for animals?
Yeah, and so the norovirus vaccine, I believe that one I don't know quite as well, but I believe there is work being done to develop a vaccine for that. That certain viruses are a little bit tough because there's different strains. So I can go to that first picture. Let's see if I can get to the picture. So this is just a picture in that first slide. Oh, here, this one works. Oh. So yeah, so this is norovirus. Let me try and get the pointer. Right, and so when you make a vaccine, what you're actually trying to do is show the body either the whole virus or a part of that virus that it will then recognize as foreign and attack. And so that's what people have done with coronavirus. And luckily, it seems like with coronavirus, there are some different strains and mutants, but it seems like once your body develops an immune response to one, it seems to work pretty well. At least so far, it seems like people aren't getting reinfected after they get the vaccine. We still have a lot to learn, but so far, not. And that was the case like with hepatitis as well, that they can make a good vaccine. Norovirus is a little bit trickier because some of these proteins either have sugars on them or are a little bit different, and your body might be able to recognize one type, or maybe not the other type quite as well, which is the same kind of for flu. So flu has these proteins on its surface that can change a bit. And so that's why you need to get vaccinated each year for flu. Your body might recognize one type of flu, but the next year another type is there, and it won't recognize that because these proteins have shifted just enough to escape your immune system. So it's kind of a long answer, but so there is work on norovirus. It's just a little bit harder to generate a vaccine. In terms of how efficient it is in an animal, so for the norovirus, I don't know if anyone's working on an animal vaccine for that, but that would be something that would be kind of interesting. I know I think for salmonella in the United Kingdom, there's a vaccine that seems to be pretty effective in chickens. So similar kind of idea that you're kind of showing the immune system proteins or pieces, now in this case of a bacteria, and this way when your body sees the actual bacteria, it will remove it. And in chickens, it seems to work decently well.
Thanks for answering my question. I have one more. Is are animal vaccines different from human vaccines, and how so? Because I know like we always talk about like the after effects of vaccines. So what is there like any like of that we have to take in consideration for foods, especially for like we're consuming that animal later?
So the basic idea is pretty much the same. You're kind of pre-exposing your body, your immune system to a pathogen or even a toxin in some cases. And this way, in the hope that when your body's exposed to the real pathogen or toxin, it will really quickly develop an immune response and get rid of it. So ideally, there are cases where there's, at least in terms of being vaccinated yourself, there can be some off-target effects depending on the type of vaccine. So people have tried, and when vaccines were first developed, they were very kind of crude, like the first iterations of them, the first versions were pretty much just virus that had been killed. So, which is great. It develops a really good immune response because it's just the actual virus. But if you don't do a really good job killing your virus, you can actually get sick from the vaccine. And some of these newer vaccines, especially the ones that are coming out now, you're only giving a part of the virus. You're not even giving the full thing. So there's less risk there because you don't have the entire infectious agent. It's just a little piece. So it really is just a boost on the immune response. So in terms of eating an animal that's been vaccinated, it shouldn't have much of an effect. All you've done is kind of given that animal the ability to recognize that pathogen when it becomes exposed to it. But if it's not exposed to it, it's going to be the same. In case like a chicken, it would be the exact same as any other chicken. It has its immune system. Its immune system is just ready to go in case it sees salmonella in that case. But it shouldn't have any impact on you eating that food. You shouldn't have any impact that way.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much, John. So I do want to just give the students just one more opportunity to ask an additional question. That will be our last one for the night. I know we've ran over time, but I know this session was so informative and intriguing that I'm glad that you were all able to stick with us and hear all the information that John had to share. So if you don't have any additional questions, I don't see any of them coming in. Again, I just want to thank everyone for their participation. I am excited to see you hopefully joining the New Jersey Youth Institute program, the virtual program. Unfortunately, we will not be hosting it face-to-face on campus on March 5th, 2021, but we will be hosting the virtual program for students who are interested. And we hope that either today's topic or one of the topics from our series, piqued your interest for you to write your paper for the New Jersey Youth Institute program and participate with other students who are also going to be writing about food security issues that are impacting really the world, not just our local communities. So at this point, I just want to thank you, John, for your participation, both your expertise as a scientist, but also as an alum of Rutgers and the School of Environmental and Biological Sciences. We're so delighted to have you and that our students got to meet you and hear from you and ask you specific questions. We hope to have you join us in a future event, but we hope you stay safe and enjoy your holidays. And everyone, I hope you do the same. And I look forward to seeing you all soon virtually. But again, hopefully we get to see each other in person, face to face, when we're back on campus. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your evening.